I did mention a few minutes ago that Russell would have disagreed a bit with the way that I presented acquaintance, because I suggested that ordinary things like tables and chairs are things that could be known by acquaintance. So, well, on the way I was presenting it, while most things we're able to think about through description, there still is a large class of objects that we're directly acquainted with, and so that we can think about because we know them by acquaintance. But actually, really, Russell thinks that the things that we know through acquaintance is much more limited than the way I've been presenting it. In fact, he thinks that it's only really these things he calls sense data that we're directly acquainted with through perception. And so even familiar objects in the ordinary world, like tables and chairs, for him are ultimately going to be known by description. They're going to be known as the things that cause these sense data. So I'm going to say a little bit about what his view was, about why he thought there are these things called sense data, and that they're really the things we're acquainted with through perception. But then I'm going to tell you about why we're basically going to bracket that for the rest of the lecture. Now, Russell's take on perception is a little bit eccentric. Maybe not eccentric for his time, but he holds a view of perception that is kind of unpopular nowadays. I'll tell you a little bit what his view is, but as I'm going to emphasize in a second, you don't really need to buy into his view exactly of perception to think that there's something important that he's getting at. So particularly around this time period, but it's a view that stretches quite far back in the history of philosophy, people thought that perception worked in kind of a number of stages. And I'll actually start with the kind of picture of perception that you might normally have before you start thinking about any philosophy at all. So imagine you're in a room, you see like a cat on a mat, there's the mat, there's the cat, maybe it looks more like a bunny, who cares? So you might have thought, well, perception sort of works directly like this. You know, maybe the light enters your eye, you perceive the cat directly because you stand in a certain kind of causal relationship to it. Namely, light bounces off the cat, which goes into your eye, which causes you to sense certain things, which then comes to make you realize that there's a cat on the mat. So this is a model of perception where perception is pretty direct. You perceive the objects directly themselves. But this is the kind of picture that Russell is rejecting in this paper. He thinks that perception is actually not like this. And in fact, he thinks perception is a little bit more complicated. So I'll tell you what the view is first, and then I'll tell you something about why he held it. So in actual fact, Russell thinks that, so that was a two-stage theory. Russell thinks that perception really happens in three stages. So what happens is this. So as again, we have the cat on the mat. Again, you have some sort of causal relationship. But what happens is that this causes you to have certain kinds of sensations. You know, maybe you have sort of, maybe the sensations, they're like presentations of color and shape, so you know you have a mental sort of perceptual picture of the cat on the mat. So what happens is that the cat causes this. Maybe I'll rub the arrow up here. You know, the light bouncing off the cat causes this sort of picture to form in your head or in your mind, and then perception is basically being aware of that picture. The perception bit is sort of grasping the mental picture that forms in your head once the light hits your eye. And this sort of middle step, this sort of mental picture, is composed of what are called sense data. And the view generally was that sense data, well, they're sort of like just like primitive feelings of like color and shape and size and things like that. So again, you can sort of think about it like a mental picture. Sense data have color, they sort of appear to you in a, you know, two-dimensional grid or something like that. And Russell thinks it's really the sense data that you're directly acquainted with. You're not actually directly acquainted with the cat at all, because there's this intermediate stage of the mental picture of the cat that forms and that's what you're acquainted with. Now, why did Russell think that? Well, the reason for positing sense data largely comes from what's called the argument from illusion. And the idea is, well, think about two cases. Suppose in one case, I'm looking at a stick that looks bent to me. And the reason the stick is bent is because it's actually bent. And suppose the stick is just lying on the table, it's a bent stick. I perceive it in the normal way, so something looks to me to be bent. But think about another case where you have a perfectly straight stick that's shoved underwater. Now, when things are put underwater, because of the way the optics work, the object will appear to be sort of bent. And maybe we can imagine that the way the straight stick looks underwater is exactly how the bent stick appears when it's not above water. So the two things look the same to me. And then the question is, people ask when they want to give an argument for sense data, is they say, well, look, clearly something looks bent to you. Like, that's certainly how things appear. It looks to you like something is bent, namely the stick. But it can't be the stick itself, surely, because, the stick itself in the second case is really a straight stick. So they think, but since there really is something that looks bent in both cases, really it must be there's something like a sense data. In both cases, what's really going on is that you're grasping the sense data. Now, because in the two cases, things look the same to you, you have the same sense data. And so it's the sense data, really, or it's something in the sense data that looks to be bent to you. So by positing this idea of sense data, these sort of mental pictures that happen in the course of perceiving something, we can explain why in cases of illusions, where objects don't in reality have certain properties, we can explain why they appear to have certain properties, or why it appears that there is something with that property. Another even clearer case is maybe illusions with colors. So there's actually a real life case which maybe is helpful here. So a few years ago there was this very famous case on social media about the dress. So there was this picture of a dress, and for some reason it just looked drastically different to different people. So to some people it looked white and gold, to other people it looked black and blue. So there's a really kind of radical illusion going on. And the reason why you think it's an illusion is because, well, they can't both be right. The dress is either white and gold, or it's blue and black. It can't be both. It has to be one or the other. So somebody's getting it wrong in either case. But it does seem to everybody. So to one class of people, it does seem like there's something white and gold. And to the other class of people, it seems like there's something blue and black. And so suppose it's actually white and gold, and focus on the people who are wrong, the people who think it looks blue and black. Well, the dress doesn't look blue and black, but clearly it appears to them as if there's something blue and black there. They have all the same feelings that they would get. I mean, it really looks to them like there's something blue and black there. How do you explain that? What is it that looks blue and black if it's not the dress itself? And again, the idea is that what looks blue and black is the sense data. The reason why it appears to be that there's something blue and black there is that the external objects cause this perceptual appearance. They cause these sense data. It's the sense data, they look blue and black. And that's why, it seems to you that there is something in blue and black. Because ultimately there really is something that looks blue and black. It's the sense data and not the dress itself. But notice we'd have to say the same thing in the other case as well. So in the case of the people who are getting it right, it's also true that for them there's a sense data that appears to them. It really looks to them like there's something that's white and gold. However, it's not the dress directly itself that they perceive. Rather, they perceive the sense data, and it's the sense data that looks white and gold. That's a quick explanation of what sense data are supposed to be, and the argument for illusion, which is the reason why many people have thought that there must be sense data. So we said that one way to be acquainted with something is through perception. Now, people might disagree about what exactly are the things that you perceive. Some people think that you perceive objects in the worlds directly. Other people, like Russell, think that you don't perceive the objects themselves. You really perceive these sort of mental objects that are caused by the objects. But everybody agrees that you perceive something. And in particular, perception is a way of being directly acquainted with something or other. There might be disagreement about what exactly it is. It might be objects in the world. It might be some sort of copies of them in the head, but everybody thinks that whatever it is that you perceive, you are acquainted with it. So you can perfectly well agree with Russell when he says there are just two ways to know what something is. There's to know it by acquaintance and to know it by description, even if you disagree with him about sense data. So Russell, as a matter of fact, thinks that there's very little that we know directly by acquaintance. Most of it is through description, because he has this view of sense data. He thinks that, well, really, the only way in which you know what the chair is, or what the table is, or the laptop or computer you're watching this on is because you can think about that object as the thing which is, the thing, whatever it is, which is causing my sense data corresponding to it. So he thinks that a lot of things in the external world you don't know by acquaintance, you actually know them by description as the things that are causing your sense data. But we don't necessarily have to go along with them. Now maybe you like the argument by illusion. Most people now don't tend to like the argument from illusion. Most people are much happier than Russell was to say that we do directly perceive objects in the external world. But you can think that even while maintaining that Russell was right, that there really are these two ways of knowing what something is. And because this idea of sense data has become very controversial, I just want you guys to see that even while Russell himself uses sense data to talk about what acquaintance is, it's not really essential to the view. The view about sense data is really an extra view that Russell had about perception, but not one that we ourselves need to have when we think about his view. And in particular, to give the view the fairest run possible, it's actually probably easier to set aside Russell's own views about sense data, as it may give us a more plausible version of his view.